Dr. Schwartz, it's all yours, part two.
Right, let me just, can't show self-view. Now I can see, okay, fine. So good evening, well, good morning to all of you. And last time I spoke about how a controversy and a feud between a couple of medievalists had its secondary implications, which eventually turned into the circumstances that gave rise to the first major respectable anti-Semitic attack on the Jews in German academia and journalism, which led in a very direct way towards the Holocaust. And as I told you, I got to it apropos of a very trivial phenomenon. I ran across a comma that shouldn't have been there, and one thing led to another. I have something similar now, but this one is much more in my field. My real field is the study of ancient Jewish history. I spend a lot of time studying Josephus. I'm finishing a big book about Josephus lately. And one of the main historians of the Second Temple period in Israel, specialist in Josephus, as you'll see, was the man whose figure you see in front of you now, Avraham Shalit, who, as you see, was born in Galicia in 1898, did his doctorate eventually in Vienna on Josephus. Then he taught in a Jewish school in Czechoslovakia for a couple of years until he moved to Palestine in 1929. He worked as an official in the health services until 1950, when he eventually got a job as a professor of Jewish history at Hebrew University. And he stayed in that job until the 60s when he retired, and he died in Jerusalem in 1979. I actually met him only twice. Once I heard him give a lecture when I was an undergraduate student, and once I asked him a question about why he translated a certain passage in Josephus a certain way, and he gave me an answer, but that was all. I really had very little contact with him personally. He was the generation of my own teachers. But eventually, apropos of what I'm telling you about now, I started writing some things about Shalit. And the first one in particular lies behind the lecture I'm giving today on Avraham Shalit, Herod, Josephus, the Holocaust. Horst R. Murring, who was a scholar who attacked Shalit posthumously, and I claimed he didn't really understand what Shalit was about, and the study of ancient Jewish history. But eventually, as you see, I also wrote another one about the lost first stage, because Shalit's doctoral dissertation was lost for 70 years, and then it was found, and I was able to write about that. And then eventually something else was found, and I was able to write about that as well. So the file on Avraham Shalit has become more and more clear over the last few decades as things that were lost became found again. And I'm going to give you something of a picture of that. And I'll be speaking mostly about modern history, but it's going to be how modern history is shown by the study of ancient history. First, let me just put the Second Temple period into focus. And Rabbi Kelman said that you've been hearing lectures about archaeology, so probably a lot of this is bursting through open doors, but I'll just do it very summarily. This is the Second Temple period at a glance. It begins when the first temple is destroyed by the Babylonians in 587, 586 BCE. But after a while, the Babylonians are overcome by the Persians and the Medes, and Cyrus the Mede conquers Babylonia and allows the Judeans to return to Judea, just like he allows other peoples to return to their places and to restore their temples that had been destroyed or pillaged by the Babylonians. And Cyrus, as a wise king, makes this nice gesture to his new subjects. The Persian period then goes on for 200 years with one Persian king after another. And during those 200 years, it's the famous period of the Persian wars against the Greeks. But eventually, the Greeks get the upper hand after Alexander the Great succeeds his father, who had conquered Macedonia just to the north of Greece and had conquered most of Greece as well. Alexander the Great takes the war to the east and eventually conquers Persia, including the entire Persian Empire, including therefore Palestine. And with 332 BCE, when Alexander the Great comes through our part of the world, the Hellenistic period begins. The Hellenistic period divides up basically into 2 or 3 sub-periods from a Jewish point of view. First, there's 20 years or so of confusion during which the would-be successors or the wannabe successors of Alexander the Great fight each other. And eventually Ptolemaic rule, which is based in Egypt, is set up in Judea, and it lasts until 200 BCE. Then the Seleucid kingdom, which is based in Syria to the north, takes over. And I wrote that it lasts until 168 when the Judean rebellion under the Maccabees begins. But it actually goes on longer because it's only in 140 BCE that the Hasmoneans actually managed to set up their kingdom. And they ruled until 63 BCE when the Romans came along. You can decide whether you want Hasmonean rule to be just another item under Hellenistic rule, or whether you want to dignify it by giving it its own place on the margin. But one way or the other, the Romans put an end to it in 63 BCE when they came through, and in the course of conquering the entire Mediterranean and around the Mediterranean, they took over Syria and then Palestine as well. And first Rome rules via a Hasmonean vassal, Hyrcanus II. He'll be important a little bit later as well, until 40 BCE. But eventually, when the Parthians, who were on the eastern side of the Euphrates, invaded, they put an end to Hyrcanus's rule, and one thing led to another, and Herod, who had been working in Hyrcanus's administration, became king of Judea on behalf of Rome, and with Roman support was able to take over his kingdom. And he remained king of Judea until his death in 4 BCE, at which point his kingdom was split up into various parts, mostly among 3 of his sons, who each got a part of the kingdom. And Rome, you know, has the saying about dividing and ruling. Rome started picking up these 3 parts one after another and putting them under Roman rule. It begins in 6 CE when Judea proper becomes under direct Roman rule, and Rome starts sending governors, including Pontius Pilate, the most famous of them all. And by 44 CE, yes, we've turned the millennium now, so the numbers are going up. By 44 CE, all of Palestine is reunited, just like it was under Herod, but now it's reunited under Roman rule. And that will continue until the 7th century when the Arabs come along. But the Jews tried a couple of times to put an end to it unsuccessfully. The first big time came in the year 66 CE when the Judeans rebelled against Rome. And that lasted for a few years and ended with the destruction of the temple and of the city of Jerusalem in 70 CE. And a couple of years later with the fall of Masada and other Roman mopping up operations after the fall of Jerusalem. And then another couple generations later, there was another big try like this, the rebellion under Bar Kokhba, which similarly failed. And at that point, Roman rule in Palestine was solidified for another 500 years until the Arabs came and took it away. So that's the Second Temple period, and the Herodian period is here towards the end. And that's the period we're going to be focusing on. Avram Shalit, I told you, did his doctorate in Vienna in 1927 is when he completed his degree. His degree is, you see, his dissertation was on Josephus und Justus Studien zur Vita des Josephus. It's a dissertation about Josephus's Vita, Josephus's autobiography. And Josephus had an enemy, a competitor called Justus from Tiberias. And Shalit wrote his dissertation trying to understand between the two of them. Eventually, it was published as an article in 1933 in a journal called Clio. After he moved to Palestine, he was working, I told you, as an official in the health system, but he kept on doing research at night. And whenever he could steal time to do it. He published a book in 1937 on Roman administration in Palestine, Hamishtar HaRoma'i Be'eretz Yisrael, which is a very detailed book about how Rome set up its provincial rule in Palestine. And he worked on translating Josephus's works into Hebrew. And he put out finally in 2 volumes in 1943, 1944, Tafshin Dalet, he put out 2 volumes which included the first half of Josephus's Antiquities. Josephus's Antiquities has 20 books, and his Hebrew translation with annotations of books 1 to 10 came out in 43, 44. So you could see he was a productive scholar. Even before he got a job at the university, he was basically working on his scholarly career while he was making a living in the health system. This translation of Josephus was where my particular interest in what I'm going to talk to you today began. Because it all began with a footnote. Just like last week, it all began with a comma. This time it all began with a footnote. Here you have a passage from page 23 in the Roman pagination of the introduction to Schwartz's translation of Josephus. He's talking here about Josephus's attitudes towards Roman rule. And he's talking here about the lessons which his history can teach. And he's come to the point where he's saying that Josephus thought that God had moved to the Roman side. This is a theme that Josephus bespeaks a couple of times. That God had moved to the Roman side, and that explains how it happened that the Romans won the war against the Jews. And he also claims, therefore, that it was wrong for Jews to oppose Rome because God was on Rome's side. So this is what Josephus is writing here in his introduction. And here in footnote 35, this is apropos of what he writes here. What Josephus is writing here has to do not only with individuals, but also with Klal Yisrael, the whole Jewish people. And he has a footnote. And the footnote says, Josephus developed this idea especially in War 5-367. And now I say, what does he say there? Where Josephus declares that God has passed over to the Romans. I discussed this question in my article in German, Zur nationalpolitischen Theorie des Josephus, which means about Josephus's national political theory, which has not yet been published. And I was reading the introduction, which was written in 1944, and published in 1944, and I said, oh, so let me see if I can find the article, because if in 1944, Schwartz said he had written an article in German on this topic, probably it's appeared by the time I'm reading this in the 1980s. And I started looking for the article, and I couldn't find it anyplace. Now that is not so surprising. It frequently happens that scholars announce that they're working on a publication, and it never appears because they changed their mind, because they decided their idea wasn't a good one, because the publishing house that they thought was going to publish it went bankrupt. Many things happen. But in the course of looking for this article, I was looking through all sorts of lists of publications about Josephus and lists of publications by Schwartz and lists of publications about antiquity in general. And I discovered that in 1933, 34, Taf Resh Tzaded Dalet, 10 years before this introduction came out, Schwartz had published an article in Hebrew called Josephus and His National Political Views. And this came out in Moznaim, which is a Hebrew publication, which is accessible. It's published by the Association of Israeli Writers, Palestinian writers at that time. And this article existed. And it was a 9-page or 10-page article, which was detailed with footnotes in German and Latin and Greek, like scholars write articles. And you wonder what's going on. This was the starting point for my present investigation. Why in the world would a scholar publishing something in 1944 in Hebrew refer his readers to a German article that has not yet appeared, rather than referring them to a Hebrew article on the very same topic that had already appeared a decade earlier? And even if we suppose that he had better ideas, he had changed his mind, he had better formulations, whatever, normally a scholar could be expected to say, in the meantime, see this preliminary version that I published 10 years ago. It cannot be that Shalit, in writing this footnote, was not aware of the fact he had already written on this topic 10 years earlier. Shalit was not insane, and he had a very good memory. And if he wrote this, it means he was trying to hide that earlier article. And that, of course, made it interesting to start saying, well, what happened? Yeah, what's going on here? So this was the question which I was working on. Why refer Hebrew readers to a non-extant German article rather than an extant Hebrew one? Was the question which got me going. So before, I already told you, these were Shalit's first books. A dissertation on Josephus, a work about Roman administration in Palestine, translation of Josephus. He's doing a lot of Josephus. Josephus, however, is our main source of knowledge for Herod. Josephus writes a huge amount about Herod. Josephus wrote in his Antiquities 20 books. The first 10 books are Josephus's summary of biblical history. The last 10 books are Josephus's summary of post-biblical Jewish history. Of them, almost 3 whole volumes, hundreds of pages, have to do with Herod. That's much more detailed than he has about anything else. There's a good reason for it. Josephus had access to a source that was written in Herod's court. Herod had a diplomat and historian who worked for him, whose name was Nicholas of Damascus. And Nicholas wrote a whole lot with very, very close perspective because he was living there at the time. He wrote a whole lot about Herod's regime, and Josephus had all of this at his access, and he used it. So a guy who's writing a lot about Josephus might well find himself writing a lot about Herod. And basically, when you think about Shalit today, what you think is, he's the guy who wrote everything about Herod and everything about Josephus. So on the one point, he puts out 3 of these volumes translating the entirety of Josephus's Antiquities. Before, I told you that the first half came out in 43, 44. The second half came out in 1963. Moreover, he went on working on this in a big way because, as opposed to the first half where he published the first 10 books of Antiquities with annotations, the second half he published without annotations because, as he writes in the preface, they keep on growing and growing and growing. And his students remembered he had these 4 huge ring binders, 4 huge notebooks full of his draft commentary on the second half of Antiquities. It never appeared. After he died, his heirs threw them out, which is one of the major tragedies of this type of work. But they did. But nevertheless, he went on working on that. On the other hand, he started working on Herod. And here you have his magnum opus. I have it here so you can see what it looks like. Big, heavy book. You see? Is Shalit's book, König Herodes der Mann und sein Werk, King Herod the Man and His Work, his accomplishments. Very, very scholarly book. It's 900 pages long. It's got 48 editions and 15 appendices in very small print, full of Greek and Latin. But it's all about Herod. Everything you wanted to know about Herod. It came out in 69, and in second edition somewhat later. The Hebrew version, however, of his work on Herod came out already in 1960. Hordos HaMelech HaYishu Folo, a big book about Herod. And in this book, he tells you everything you want to know about Herod, about what he did, and what the sources say, and what they mean, and why Herod did what he did. And he gives his own interpretation of Herod's career as a vassal king on behalf of Rome. And to understand what Herod and Josephus have to do with each other, in other words, what's the integrity of Shalit's career, where he's spending so much time on Herod and so much time on Josephus, they both have a very salient common denominator, namely, Herod and Josephus both accepted Roman rule in Palestine. They both accepted foreign rule in Palestine. Now, this was something which, before I go on, you have to remember, before the Romans, there were the Hasmoneans. The Hasmoneans had set up a sovereign Jewish state, home rule. They had rebelled against foreign rule and set up a state which was ruled by Jewish high priests, who eventually became Jewish kings as well. Mattathias, Judah Maccabee, Simon, Jonathan, John Hyrcanus, Alexander Yanai, Shlom Tzion, his widow. These are all sovereign Jewish rulers whose state was put an end to by Herod. And while there were lots of Jews who were not happy with that and who rebelled against that and who went on rebelling against that as time went on and eventually rebelled against it in a big way and brought about the destruction of the temple and of Jerusalem, what Josephus and Herod have in common is they both accepted Roman rule. So Herod, you hear here on the left a little bit more of his career. He was born probably in 72 BCE, died in 4 BCE. His father was a senior administrator in the regime of Hyrcanus II, who was the Roman vassal ruler after the Romans took over Palestine in 63 BCE. Herod eventually became a vassal king, and they called him an ally, which is a nice name, but it means he's a subservient ruler under Roman oversight. First, he married a Hasmonean princess, and one of the relics of the old regime. He married Miriam, but then he killed off all of the Hasmoneans, including Miriam. So that probably means that he first thought he would try and make himself legitimate in nationalist Jewish eyes by marrying into the native dynasty. But when he realized that wasn't going to work because they didn't take him seriously, he killed them all. And this is part of the detailed story that Josephus tells. He kills Miriam, he kills Miriam's mother, who's his mother-in-law. He kills Hyrcanus II, for whom he used to work. He kills Miriam's his own brother-in-law, who was a high priest and was competing with him as well. And in the end, the Hasmonean dynasty is finally made to disappear by Herod, not by the Romans themselves. And he built all over. I understand you had lectures about that. He built all over. Kings in antiquity typically sought glory by wars or by building. And as a vassal king of Rome, Herod couldn't be involved in wars, but he was very involved in building. I put here the main places because they're main both in terms of his efforts and also because of their symbolism. He built a whole lot in Caesarea, which is a city on the coast facing the Mediterranean and named after the Roman emperor. And he built a whole lot in Jerusalem, including the Temple Mount, of which he increased the size greatly. And he built the temple and made it a glorious place to such an extent the rabbis will eventually record the saying that he who has not seen Herod's temple has never seen a beautiful building. And they're both then very serious building projects, but they're also very symbolic because they show what Herod was about. He's building the Roman capital of Judea, and he's building the Jewish capital of Judea. He's saying the Romans have their capital here, and that's Caesarea. The Jews have their capital here where their sovereign, namely God, has his house. And I take care of both of them because I'm pointing to a way in which Jews can have their religion and the Romans can have their state and we can all live together. And there are lots of Jews who are not happy with that because they wanted the state as well. Next time, I think it is, I'll be talking about religion and state and rebels against Rome, so I won't go on about that now. So there are a lot of people who condemned Herod for being a collaborator with Rome, for accepting Roman rule and finishing Rome's job of putting an end to the native Jewish dynasty. Josephus also accepted Roman rule. He began as a very, very Jerusalemite type. He comes from an aristocratic priestly family in Jerusalem, born in the year 37. He's such an aristocratic family that when the rebellion begins, he is among the leaders of the rebellion. I mentioned some stuff about Gretz last week and what Gretz had to say about Josephus's role as a leader of the rebellion. But when he is captured by the Romans, he becomes a respected prisoner and he translates for the Romans and he gives them local knowledge and he becomes friends with Vespasian, the emperor, and then with Titus, who was the general who eventually destroyed Jerusalem and eventually became emperor as well. And he became an historian who wrote 4 books, The War, the Antiquities, The Life and the Against Apion. And of these books, it's easy to see that War and Antiquities, at least, accept Roman rule. And they preach, for example, that which Shalit quoted before, that the Jews had been so bad that God abandoned them and went over to the Roman side. They preach that the Romans deserve to win the war because the Jewish rebels that he depicts are all wicked people and terrorists and very cruel people, and therefore they deserve to lose. The Jews in general deserve to lose the war because they allowed themselves to be led by such despicable rebels. His other works are more apologetic works insofar as they defend himself, the life, and they defend Jews and Judaism and against Apion. But it was very typically the case that Jews in the modern era, when they started becoming interested in things like that, denounced Josephus as being a traitor. And we saw something of that in Gretz last week and saw how Gretz dealt with it when the Germans started becoming too interested in Jewish treason. So my point now is simply that when Shalit spends his career writing about Josephus and about Herod, he's really dealing with the same problematics through different eyeglasses. Once he's doing it through Josephus as an historian, once he's doing it through Herod as a statesman, but one way or the other, he's dealing with the same problematics of how should Jews who once had a sovereign state of their own in their own country, which their sacred scripture says was given to them by their God, how should Jews relate to a foreign power which conquers that territory? And he's doing this, first of all, in the 1920s and 30s when Britain is ruling Palestine. And then he's doing it in the 50s and 60s when there's been a successful Jewish revolt against that. Now, his book came out in 1960, and I thought it's a very detailed book. But he doesn't only deal with the details, he has his perspectives and his general interpretation. And the very last lines of the book in Hebrew read as follows in my translation. One can understand Herod's contemporaries who were full of disgust and rage at the sight of the king's ways and deeds in public and private affairs. And we can understand that people then were really disgusted by him. Remember, just as an example, I told you he killed off all the last Hasmoneans, including his wife. Well, I forgot to mention he killed his wife's children as well in the end. He killed his children by that wife in the end as well because he thought they were plotting against him. But we who look upon the ways of the man and the king from the distance of 2,000 years, and for whom it is easy to distinguish the lights and shadows of human life, As we have perspective, for us it is proper to weigh justly the points in his favor and those against him, after we put aside those issues that are of merely transient significance. I could put that in saying, most of the people he killed would have been dead by now anyways. So let's prescind from that and see the larger picture. When we do that, we cannot but recognize that there was a beneficial element in Herod's Roman policy, which, had the nation's leaders known how to exploit it for the good of the nation, it's possible that they would have succeeded in preventing the terrible catastrophe that befell it in the last 70 years of the Second Temple period. Herod was one of the most courageous and innovative statesmen to appear in the Jewish people in antiquity. He left behind him a great political legacy, which, however, did not find worthy heirs, those who knew how to, and here he brings the Talmudic expression, to break the cask and preserve the wine. Wine is supposed to be in casks, but the really smart people are capable of doing tricks where you can have your cake and eat it. The really smart people are those who are capable of getting the maximum out of whatever you have to lose. And Herod was able to do that. His heirs were not. Herod's heirs were wimps. It's my translation of nimushot. Do people still use the word wimps in English? Yes? All right, whatever. And so it happened that he remained kerech mikan mikan. So it happened that he remained bold on both sides. The people who remember Herod after him forgot the good that he had done, but remembered from generation to generation the monstrosities, like all of those executions. So that all that remained were the names Hordos HaRasha, the wicked Herod, and the slave of Edom, Rome. Here I should explain that Herod's descent was from Idumeans, Edomites, who had been converted by the Hasmoneans in the 2nd century BCE. But Edom was also used by Jews as a cipher for Rome, as a way of referring to Rome. So if Herod was an Eved Edomi, it means he's somebody of Idumean descent who's serving the Romans. But the historian of today must call him by the name he deserves, Herod, king of Israel, Hordos Melech Yisrael. Those are the very last lines of the book before the footnotes begin. Hordos Melech Yisrael is an obvious play on the standard phrase, David Melech Yisrael. And here, Shalit is finishing a big biography on somebody who accepted foreign rule and who was known to have murdered lots of people in order to maintain his own rule. And he's calling him like David Melech Yisrael, Herod the king of Israel. 1960. And here you have another passage from the book in which he gives some of his interpretation of Herod. He's imagining here that there may have been people who thought that Herod was a Messiah. It's possible that Herod's amazing success too had its impact and brought even his enemies to believe to some extent in his righteousness, Tzidkat Ha'ish. For this is the rule concerning matters of state and real life in every time and every place. It is final success that determines who is right. Biyadmi hatzedek. And he puts the word tzedek, righteousness, into parentheses, into quotation marks, which means that there's nothing that exists in the world of statesmanship that is just. There's only success. If you're successful, you are justified. If you're not successful, you are not justified. And Herod, he says, was quite successful. He managed to maintain the peace for more than 3 decades of rule, to build all over the country things that still stand today. And yes, he paid a price by killing people along the way, but everything has its price and things have to be done. And again, those people probably would have died sooner or later anyways. And he is justifying Herod then by espousing this point of view. This is 1960, when Israel was, and now I'll say when Israel still was, a very ideological society. Shalit aroused very, very severe criticism in Israel. He expected it. In the preface to his book on Herod in 1960, he dedicates it to Joseph Klausner, another Israeli historian, best known as a very nationalistic Israeli historian. I mentioned him last week when I talked about, I'm mentioning him next week when I talk about rebels, so we'll get to him next week. A very nationalistic Israeli historian who was a friend of Shalit, and he died in 1958, a little before the book came out, and Shalit dedicates the book to his memory, although I am certain that had he read the book, he would have sentenced me to death in boiling water, Adanoti berotchin, for having desecrated Kodshei Ha'umah, the holy things of the nation, in his opinion. He would have thought it was a violation of the nation's sanctity to compare Herod to David or to say something nice about Herod. And he got it. He got very severe criticism. Georg Kressel, who was one of the major Israeli critics of the day, writes an article in 1961-62 on Herod, namely the book Herod, an example of abominable Machiavellianism. You know about Machiavelli, that the only thing which should guide rulers is what works. It was the shock that I experienced upon reading this book that brought me to turn to the public with regard to this new old doctrine and its consequences. It justifies the most abominable and murderous jungle in human relations. I felt a deep shock upon reading such things in Hebrew, Lashon Kodesh. And in this day and age, after we have seen how millions have been murdered and incarcerated in the name of a system, which too is political wisdom, and then after a few years, on the basis of another political wisdom, that arch murderer was thrown out as something hateful from his resting place in his mausoleum. Here he's alluding to the fact that a few months before, in October 61, Khrushchev had decided to condemn Stalinism and had Stalin's body removed from Lenin's mausoleum. And here he's saying that Shalit is talking about Herod, who's just like Stalin, and how could one possibly, who murdered millions of people, how could one possibly do this in Hebrew? Or Yitzchak Ber, who was at that time the dean of Israeli historians. He was the president of the Israeli Historical Society forever. He was the chief editor of the Journal of the Israeli Historical Society. In writing an article about Josephus, he writes, Shalit flatters the aristocrats and rulers of Rome while negating the honor of the Jewish people and denying its right to save its soul from a governmental system that was dedicated entirely to cruel murder and sexual perversity. How could anybody possibly say anything on behalf of Rome or on behalf of Herod or Josephus, who accepted Roman rule? And this really got people where it hurt. In 2007, the late Professor Aryeh Kasher of Tel Aviv still thought it necessary to write a whole book against Shalit. The whole point of departure of Kasher's book about Herod is to show just how wrong Shalit was to try and say something nice and justify Herod. Shalit responded, first of all, by writing an essay in 1962. This is the way professors respond. Instead of responding directly to his critics, what he did is he gave a lecture in 1962 about Theodor Mommsen, who we ran across already last week and we'll run across again in the future. Great, great German historian who wrote The History of Rome. This is the book that got Mommsen the Nobel Prize in 1902. And Shalit, in writing about Mommsen, both as a separate lecture as an introduction to the Hebrew translation of Mommsen's History of Rome, he writes, for Mommsen, Julius Caesar was not the murderer of the Roman Republic. He was, but that's not what he was. Rather, for Mommsen, Julius Caesar was the one who wasn't a murderer. Rather, he did what he had to do. Pompey, on the other hand, was a small man, Adam Katan, for he was not able to do that which was possible to do and that he was supposed to do. In other words, there are things that rulers have to do, and if they do them, even if they entail murder, they're not murder. They're the things that have to be done. Like I said before, if Herod wants to stay in power for 30 some odd years, he's going to have to kill some people along the way. Some people were trying to rebel against Rome or rebel against him and upset the public order. Look what happened when Herod died, Shalit would say. We'll see it in a moment. When Herod died, he was succeeded by people who weren't capable of keeping good order, and things turned into rebellions against Rome, which brought about massive destruction. Wouldn't it have been nicer if they killed a few people along the way, here and there? But Shalit's main response was different. His main response was to turn away from Israel. Shalit had been in Israel since 1929, and now, in the 1960s, look at his list of publications. You know, when professors die, people publish books in their memory, and the books typically include a list of their publications. Here you see, in 1962, he's still publishing in Hebrew. In 1963, he's still publishing in Hebrew. In 1964, he's still publishing in Hebrew. 1965 comes an article in English, and an article in German in 66, and a book in German, which I colored in yellow because it's a book in 1968, and a book in German in 1969, and an article in English. And what happened to the Hebrew? And in these years, I can tell you, Shalit is also spending more and more time in Germany, among other things, to finish his work on this book, which came out in 1968. This, as you see, is a very technical book. It's a concordance to the names of persons and of places, toponyms in Josephus, nomen vertebral to Flavius Josephus, a dictionary of names in Flavius Josephus, which he did mostly on site in Germany, working with German colleagues, writing in German, which was his mother tongue. And basically what happened is Shalit got so turned off by the reception which he got in Hebrew, whereas he was being respected by his friends abroad in Germany, and probably an older man who's already in his 60s and already in his 70s, likes returning to his native language as well. One way or the other, Shalit left Israel and went someplace else where he felt that people appreciated him more. They didn't accuse him of writing books on behalf of Stalin. Other people wrote about him justifying Hitler, because Hitler killed lots of people and he tried to keep his state together, so you'd probably justify him as well. And of course, in 1960, to be positioned in Israel as somebody who would justify Hitler or Stalin or Herod or Josephus was something which made you very, very lacking in respect. Next week, I'll talk about rebels against Rome, and you'll see just how high the stock of rebels against Rome was in the 1960s, the years of the Masada excavations. Shalit was on the other side, and he left. Also, his last manuscripts. After he died in 1989, a book came out, which is put out in Manhattan, 500 pages of a book about an apocryphal book. Or lately, not too long ago, I was given in 2013 a manuscript which was saved in 2005 from a trash can in Mainz. It's a long story. I wrote about it, but here you see I have an article coming out about it. But 200 more page manuscript that looks like this, in which Shalit was writing a German commentary on antiquities. I told you he was writing a Hebrew commentary on the last half of Antiquities, and it never came out. It never came out because he never finished it, because he decided to write it in German instead. And he never finished it in German either. His family threw out the Hebrew version. One of his colleagues threw out the German version, but somebody saved it from the trash can and eventually gave it to me, and now it's in the manuscript division of the National Library here in Jerusalem, where I donated it. But you see, he has been, look at this, he has been spending his time proofreading, preparing for publication, a manuscript on Josephus in German. His whole life has become a life about Josephus and Herod in German, as opposed to one in Hebrew. Now, what's interesting is that in the 1930s, Shalit's position on Herod was the opposite of his position in 1960. Here you have a passage from a letter. I'll show you the letter in a minute. This is the letter in Hebrew. Shalit's writing Klausner in 1933. Shalit's in Palestine already for 4 years. He's in touch with everybody who's in the business. I believe that we may in complete tranquility admit Josephus's baseness, navlut, without our having to be embarrassed. As we Jews don't have to be embarrassed to admit that now and then there are bad Jews. There are such base people throughout the world among every people and tongue, and there's no necessity to declare this reptile pure. So Josephus is a reptile with Taheret Hasheretz. If we were to do that, we would produce a brief for the defense, but not at all history. Let us rather leave the Ehrenrettung, saving the honor of Josephus, to someone like Hugo Willrich, a German scholar who's anti-Semitic, who's been showing his prowess at things like that for many years and saving the honor of the evil Caligula, Herod, and others. So you see in the 1930s, Shalit is talking about Herod and Josephus, like the wicked guys, Caligula, the Roman emperor who did all sorts of terrible things, as somebody who is wicked. He is base. Here you have his letter to Klausner in his own handwriting, beautiful handwriting of the 1930s. When I tried to get the permission of Shalit's son to put this letter in an exhibition at the Israel Museum about Herod, in a discussion of how views about the Herod and Josephus had changed over the decades, his son refused because he said, this does not represent my father's more mature opinions. And I said, that's right. That's what makes it interesting. It was 180 degrees different from his father's mature opinions. And in the 1930s, that's when he published the article in Moznaim, 1933-34, that he later tried to bury. He refers to it. And in this article, he condemns Josephus for giving up on the nation's life in return for its mere existence. Shalit in 1933-34 takes the stand that a nation needs to live more than it needs to exist, which means that there are things which you can get by existing without, but you can't live without them. And when push comes to shove, you should prefer to live rather than merely to exist. Here we see Josephus on the way to complete denial and absolute negation of the national tradition. The only thing that Josephus still wants is national existence without the national principles as understood by the zealots who are rebelling against Rome. The principles of national chosenness, namely the notion that we are a chosen people, and of the necessity and therefore the justification of self-defense. Here is the main contrast between Josephus and the zealots. They did not recognize the possibility of separating the existence of the people, the nation, from its national life. And they totally rejected the view that the people is allowed to continue its life in all circumstances, namely after the loss of the principles that turn national existence into national life. He does admit that despite his degenerate character, Josephus loved his people and was worried about its future, but he only saw that future as existence, not as life, and therefore he condemns him. And by 1944, Shalit wasn't condemning Josephus anymore. Shalit wasn't condemning Herod anymore, because he was recognizing that, you can't live if you don't exist. He was recognizing that the basic condition of existence is life, of life is existence. And in a world where you can't have everything, you really ought to settle for having existence. And if you ask what made him change his mind, well, you know what happened between the 1930s and the 1950s. Here we have a passage from early in his book on Hordos HaMelech, Herod the King. He's writing about one of the last Hasmoneans who fought Rome. When Pompey came and took over Rome in 63 BCE, Aristobulus II fought against him. And Shalit is angry. Had Yanai's son, namely Aristobulus II, behaved wisely and responsibly, it's possible that the Roman rulers would not have developed their prejudice that the Jews of Palestine were a force that was hostile to the Roman state and endangered it. And that, therefore, Rome should exercise its power in order to suppress this hostile force. In any case, it seems likely that that would have softened the force of Roman rulers countered, that such was the attitude of the Jews of Palestine towards Rome from the outset. They would have started off on the right foot had the Hasmoneans welcomed Rome, since anyways they couldn't oppose Rome. The historical role that the moment of 63 BC imposed upon Aristobulus was to be a peaceful mediator between the Roman regime and the Jews of Palestine. Such mediation would have opened up the way for the Jews to participate in the great work of construction of the Roman Empire willingly and not under duress. It is likely that a willing integration would have saved the Hasmoneans' rule, there should be an apostrophe there, and the Hasmonean state. And it might even be possible to conjecture that it would have prevented the great national Shoah that came later in 66 to 70. So if we hadn't guessed it until now, Shalit is thinking about ancient Jewish history in the light of modern Jewish history of the 1940s and 50s, which showed him that, you know, when a Reich has power, it can kill an awful lot of Jews, and the stupid ones are the ones who don't recognize that. Well, here's another book of his, 71. Today we look at events in Judea in the late Second Temple period than what was usual 2 generations ago. He recognizes the change. The problematics of Jewish existence in the Roman Reich were much more complicated than what was once assumed, and it's therefore impossible to condemn Josephus as one who betrayed his people. And you hear the word Roman Reich in a German writing, and you can't write that without thinking of the Third Reich. Which means, as I come towards the end, that Shalit was looking at the options of ancient Jews in the light of those of Jews during the Holocaust, from which he concluded from the Holocaust, that it's power that makes the world go around. From that, he inferred that smart people, and I told you before we saw him saying it, the only just people are the smart people, are those who recognize who has power and make the most of things for themselves and their nation without resisting that power. While stupid people are bad people, like Aristobulus II and later rebels against Rome, who attempt to do more for themselves and their nation by resisting that power. Shalit looked at Herod and Josephus like Judenräte in a regime that was not bent on killing Jews. Now, I'll end by pointing out that until today, the best attended exhibition in the history of the Israel Museum, with hundreds of thousands of visitors, was one which was held in 2013, 2014. Maybe some of you were there, in memory of Herod. Apropos of the excavations in Herodium near Jerusalem, they did a exhibit in memory of Herod. And as you see here, this is the type of prose that the museum used in advertising the exhibition. Everybody went to see it. Had the Israel Museum tried doing an exhibition about Herod in 1960, there would have been massive demonstrations against it. 1960 is when the Eichmann trial was about to begin. 1960 was when people were still very ideological and still remembering, oh, we beat the British. We established sovereignty despite the empire that wanted to keep us from having sovereignty. By the current decade in Israel, times have changed, and people are thinking, you know, maybe Herod was really better than the options. Maybe Shalit was not so wrong. Thank you. Okay, that's what I had to say.
Professor
Okay.
Schwartz, can I ask a question, Professor Schwartz?
Absolutely.
Let me just stop the screen sharing so I can see.
It sounds very much his first, from the 30s, that he seemed to be echoing Yirmiyahu when he spoke about just giving into Bavel. and just not rebelling, and you can save the temple, which they didn't do.
And in his article in the 30s, he indeed quotes Jeremiah, and he says that Josephus was doing something similar, but he condemns Josephus for doing it. Yes, he's a little bit more consistent 40 years later. And next week, I think I'll be talking about Harkavi, who wrote a book just like that, where he compares Josephus to Jeremiah positively, but that's already several decades later. It's not the 1930s.
Thank you.
There is a question now, Dr. Schwartz, in the chat box asking for speculation. What if Herod had left a proper succession plan?
Had Herod wanted to have one of his heirs succeed him, he had 3 sons. The sons he originally planned on succeeding him were all executed because he thought that they had lost their patience and were plotting against him. But nevertheless, there was one of his sons who was Archelaus, who he preferred to the others, and he recommended he be made king, but Augustus did not allow it. So I think that probably, it's hard to guess, the Romans were in no great hurry, but nevertheless, the logic of Roman rule was to take over territories, to l'sapeach. How do you say l'sapeach in English? To incorporate into the empire, that's what empires do, they incorporate territories. There was something anomalous about Judea not being incorporated directly as a province already in 63 BCE, when Syria, for example, was, or in 30 BC when Egypt was. There was something anomalous about it, so probably it would have happened anyways. As it happened, the fact that he didn't leave his main heirs made it easier for Rome to follow a policy of divide and rule and pick it up one way or another. But they still took their time. He died in 4 BCE. It wasn't until 44 that everything was finally made part of came directly under Roman rule.
May I?
Bakasha.
Thank you. This is very distressing. What we're talking about is a Jew who winds up having been in the right place at the right time, escapes the the Shoah, and then buys into the extermination viewpoint that magia laYehudim, how do you say this in English? There's something deserving about the if only the Jews. It's apologetics for Hitler, and this is not coming from a guy. This is coming from a Yid. So the kind of self-loathing that this man must have carried is really appalling. I'm sorry, I just had to say that. It's really distressing.
I don't think I underlined that he was talking about the Roman Empire as similar to the Third Reich, but the difference was that the Romans were not out to exterminate the Jews. And therefore he was saying that the stupid people were the ones who tried to put an end to Roman rule, which was impossible, and just ended up getting lots of Jews killed. So he thought, like next week Harkavi will think, that in fact it would have been smarter for Jews and would have been more merciful on the part of Jews not to take other Jews out to war against a power that could not be defeated. And he would not at all have accepted your notion that he was defending those who would exterminate the Jews, because he was saying the Romans were perfectly willing to accept this solution.
There he is making excuses for the Germans right after the Shoah.
He's making excuses for the Romans. He's saying the Romans.
He's choosing the place and the language. It's too coincidental.
No, I don't think that's the case. Shalit was very well aware of the difference between the Romans and the Germans, but what they both had in common was overwhelming force that you couldn't defeat. And he was insisting that the Jews could have their, what he called the existence, their kiyum in the Roman rule, had they not chosen to seek more and ended up with less. He was very well aware that the Jews could not have their existence under the Nazis.
All right. Any other comments or questions or critique, I guess is.
By the way, I can tell you that Shalit was said to have had, I did not know him personally, but his friend said he was very right-wing in Israeli politics, which basically meant that if we have power, we should use it. Vis-a-vis territories conquered in the Six-Day War, for example, his position was that if you have power, that gives you what other people would call rights.
Okay, somebody's asking, maybe just take another minute or so. I guess the interaction, how rabbinic law might have developed, differently. I'll rephrase it slightly. Had the Romans not destroyed the Beit HaMikdash, how would have impacted on the whole development? That's okay.
I frequently give a survey course on ancient Jewish history, like once every second year. Then I have to give final examinations in which students have to respond to a thesis. One thesis which I've given them a few times is, what is your considered opinion on the statement that the rabbis were lucky that the Romans destroyed the temple for them? Namely, the temple was something which was the heart of a different type of religion. And the way I understand things, rabbinic religion is basically a diaspora religion. And the temple is the linchpin of the opposite of diaspora. The temple is the linchpin of homeland. But it's not, I'm not going to be able to do, I'll talk about religion and state next week, so it'll probably come up again.
Because I'll be interested to hear in next week or the week after then, how do we, quote unquote, update religion now that we're back in the land of Israel, even without a temple?
You're
What
asking me
changes?
I just worked.
No, I mean, listen, already the rabbis saw that the temple was outdated. When they say the Sanhedrin exiled itself 40 years before the destruction of the temple, the rabbis already understood the temple had lost its values. That sort of means more la'asaf, that God took out his anger on the temple, not the Jewish people. Rav Yochanan ben Zakkai didn't even try to save the temple. He said we had to rebuild Judaism. I think what you're saying is aleph beit, even though it sounds startling. I think it's very true. Right? In other words, the rabbis realized they had to rebuild Judaism different, when the prophets are real, that sacrifices are meaningless without ethics.
It's easier to do it when the Romans took the initiative to make it clear that there is no other choice.
I hear that. It's a cool question. I'm glad I'm not in your course. I don't know how I would do, but anyways, but of course that is the question I think we're all facing today. How does religion play? Developed, for sure was developed in Chutz La'aretz in 1900 years of diaspora. And, now that we're back in Israel, what changes? And I think that's one of the key, battle lines, if I can use that word, between the Haredi world and the religious Zionist world. We're in a different Israel. It's not, rabbinic Judaism has to be relooked at. I mean, even, I'll just end with this, the Dor Revi, that's the great grandson of the Chatam Sofer. I don't think anybody will. He looked like a religious man. He was thrown out of Hungary. He has in his introduction where basically, the idea of Torah Bechtav was a freezing of Judaism. We didn't want Torah. We didn't want the oral law written down because the oral law allows for flexibility, allows every case to be judged separately. Once you write it down, it gets a permanent. And the halacha didn't want that. The halacha wanted that flexibility, but that became impossible when we went to exile. We needed to write it down, otherwise we'd forget it. So we lost the the dynamic of Jewish law. And now he made Aliyah in 1921. He left Hungary, comes to Israel, very firm, for Hungary. The oldest great grandson of the Chatam Sofer, or the classic Sefer on Chulin, says now we're going to have to go back to that old system, with the oral system. We're going to have to relook at all. He wasn't the only one who said that. I mean, Rav Herzog said.
What's his name?
Dora Glasner, Shmuel Moshe, I think Shmuel Moshe Glasner. You can look him up. Dr. Lyman wrote articles about him in tradition. I think it's in his introduction to a Sefer on Chulin, where he writes a fantastic history and development of Torah Shebel. It was Rav Schachter, when I was in Rav Schachter's shir, he was the one who introduced me to the Dor Revi, and about his introductions, he was a big Zionist. That didn't go over so well in Hungary. But he also had this idea of development of halacha, and the return to Zion will have an impact on how the halacha, gets reinterpreted, and, recreating a Sanhedrin. I don't remember the whole, you talked about everything, but that's, the Sanhedrin has a lot of power to revisit even biblical laws, but that's for another shir, not for a history class, that's for a halacha class. But once you raise the issue, I felt wanted to say a few words, if I may. I take the host prerogative. You can to say my 2 cents worth. But yeah, you want to look it up. Glasner was his name. Shmuel.
Wrote it down.
Yeah. Okay. We'll see you next week.